much for having me. I'd just like to start off by saying to Matt and Nusantara Arts, thank you so much for inviting me to this guest lecture series. I think it's really incredible what you're doing with this to help the Solanese community and to keep us all engaged during this uncertain time. So thank you for that, Matt and Nusantara Arts. Today, I'd like to talk about some of the typical ways that you can organize a suite in gamelan music, specifically within the Klenengan style. So I'm not going to be talking about wayang or dance, which is in many ways a whole other beast. So this is really meant for Klenengan style playing. And what I'm going to be talking about is not in any way exhaustive of all the possibilities. There are many other things that I'm sure you can do. I'm just going to be talking about kind of some of the typical things that you can do in terms of choices that you can make, and treatment. We'll be talking about treatment a little bit with a few different gending. So, oh yes, and I'd like to say at any point in time, I highly encourage anyone with questions to jump in with a question, as opposed to waiting until the end. It'd be great if you have a question, or if there's something that I'm discussing that you feel like maybe something wasn't represented that you feel is important to represent as well. It'd be great to hear from you and hear your thoughts on some of the material. So I think maybe
let me just mention that if people want to jump in at any time, just put your name in the chat box. Just tell me that you have a question, and then we'll let Alex know whenever the soonest possible time is, and we'll have you jump in and ask your question before he moves on to the next topic.
Cool, thanks, man. So let me pull up this little thing that I made. So this is a little map that I made for us to kind of explore these possibilities, and we're going to go top down on this map. Again, this is in no way exhaustive of all the possibilities, and this is also taking the assumption that we're going to be sort of starting with a gending as opposed to starting with a ladrang or another form, and specifically soft style gending. So we won't be talking about gending bonang here. Great. So before we even get started with what gending we want to do, we have a few options that we can use before we even play a gending. So as you see at the very top, we have a patatan and we have bowo before the gending. The gending that I wanted us to explore today is a few pretty recognizable gending. Gambir Sawit is one of them. Panchat Yono is another, and then Megamandung and Palagnam is another one. So starting with patatan before all of that, what is patatan? So many of you might be familiar with this, but this might be a new concept or something that you are not too familiar with. Patatan is a free metered song that's played mainly with rebab, gender, gambang, suling. It doesn't use balungan, and in Klenengan, more often than not, it doesn't use singing, although it can use singing pretty regularly in wayang and dance. So basically, the general idea is that the rebab in Klenengan music, the rebab is in charge of leading the melody. Since there's no specific meter to it, the other musicians have to respond to the rebab and follow the rebab to various sella notes or landing cadential notes. And it basically outlines the different pitches that are typically used within one patet or mode. I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with patet. There are many different patatan that you can do. So the very first thing that we want to decide when we're thinking about a suite is what patet do we want to play in? We can play in Slendro Manyoro, we can play in Slendro Songo, Slendro Nam, Pelag Nam, Pelag Barang, Pelag Limo. There's many options. So once we decide that, then we can choose what kind of patatan we might want to play. So if we've decided we're going to play in Slendro Songo, then we can't play patatan outside of that patat. We have to choose a patatan that's within Slendro Songo. And within Slendro Songo, there's many patatan. You can do Jugag, which is the shortest, Wanta, Nalik, Abimanyu, there's many. So if we were to do a patatan in the beginning of a piece, it kind of depends on the context. So let's say we want to do a bowo before a gending. I think it's nice to use patatan wanta for this, but you can also use jugag. You want to make sure that you sort of capture the feeling of the piece. So you don't want to play a patatan that maybe is associated with sad pieces if you're not going to play a sad gending. So since we're talking about maybe going into Gambir Sawit, let's say, we can do bowo for that. And before the bowo, we do a patatan. So I'd like us to sort of listen to an example of a patatan, since some of us might not be totally familiar with what that sounds like, or we might not be able to hear that regularly with our gamelan ensembles. So let's see, I'm going to share some audio. Just give me 1 second here. And we'll listen to Patatan Wanta in Slendro Songo. So that was Patatan Wanta and Slendro Songo. From there, we could go straight to the gending. The rabab could play the buko, and we could begin Gambir Sawit. Or we could go to bowo. Bowo is also a free metered song that's usually sung by a single person, often a man, and it's usually accompanied by gender. So bowo, usually for gending, there's not just one bowo specific for that gending, but you can kind of choose several, although some gending are known to have a certain bowo more often than not. So with Gambir Sawit, there's a few different choices that you could use for a bowo. However, I think maybe the most common might be Sakaragan Rara Bentrok. And I'd like us to take a listen to that as well, because this might be another form that some of us aren't used to hearing very often. So you'll hear the vocalist singing similarly, melodic lines that sort of are headed towards a specific note, and the gender is accompanying that. And then from there, maybe I'll play just a few seconds of how the musicians go into Gambir Sawit, because with Gambir Sawit, if you use a bowo, you wouldn't play the buko from the rabab. The buko would be included in that bowo, and then the kindang would sort of give that classic intro from the buko, the few notes that the kindang plays before the rest of the ensemble comes in. So let me pull up Gambir Sawit's Bowo saka Roro Bentrok.
Temanena kang den anti gambir sawet durung muni tor iku no rambo sani wit kuno nganti saiki nadyan jam muni ping sareng durungan doni panapuwe makse uti tandha deman terus sing ngati
So that was a little bit into Gambir Sawit, and Gambir Sawit has that classic, recognizable melodic line in the very beginning. Gong, rest, 3, 5, 2, rest, 3, 5, 6, 2, 2. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but before we move on, there's a few other things that you can do with Bowo. So there are some Bowo that actually have another form embedded within them, often a jinaman, which is sort of a short song that's a little lively. Usually it uses chiblan and the other elaborating instruments, and often there's slantum and sometimes kanong, kumpul, gong, and there's vocals, sometimes just from one person, sometimes from a chorus. So the other piece that I was going to have us look at, the other gending, Panchat Yono, I figured we could take a little listen to the Bowo, one of the Bowos that you can use for it that actually has this jinaman embedded inside of it. The Bowo is Tanggaan Kenyo Kediri. And we'll listen to that and then we'll move on into the actual gending. I'm going to skip over the Patatan, but they also play Patatan Wanta as well.
Sabta catur tasih kalembak gong pandaya tup meraping ranu apan tansah kasang saya gunggulangun aduh babu sang leretno jiwa ningsun titis sipun dia ayo ke nyoke
So as you could hear, there was that little jinaman embedded sort of towards the end of the bowo there. And if you noticed with both bowo, right before the kendang comes in with the buko introduction from the kendang, the bowo becomes metered and it stays metered until the gong. So we've already done several pieces now and we haven't even started with the gending, which is pretty fun. There's so much you can do before you even begin your main idea. So maybe let's move on to gending. Let's take a look at gambir sawat, and I'm gonna pull up the notation for gambir sawat here. So we've got gambir sawat, and we've got it in slendro songo. So there are often many gending where you can actually play them in both tuning. You can play them in slendro, you can play them in pelag, and sometimes in multiple patet. Gambir sawat is an example where you can choose to play it in slendro songo. You can also choose to play it in pelag num. Although I think it's less often played in pelag num. It's most common in slendro songo. And a little bit later, we can take a look at what pelag num looks like. But first, when you have gending, that's ketuktu karap, which is just one of the forms of gending. There's many different forms. there's a few different things that we can do. So often there's always a merong section, which is kind of like home base, right? And then often there's a nalik section, which is kind of straying away from home base, usually going to the upper register. And as an ensemble, you can choose to omit the nalik or to keep it. And sometimes those choices depend on what's happening musically, and you have to respond. I like what Pat Midi was saying in his lecture, that the music is responsive and interactive, so you always have to be responding. So specifically with Gambir Sawit, we have a merong section, and more common than not, you go into this bracketed section that we can see here, which is also the merong, but this is the merong that you would repeat over and over again. You wouldn't ever go back to that rest 3-5-2, rest 3-5-6-2-2. And in this bracketed section, the gerong starts to sing. They sing a vocal melody. So if this happens, then at the end of the bracketed section, the gerong melody is fixed and it sings high, which is indicating to the rebab and the rest of the ensemble that you have to move on to nalik. And then you move on to nalik and the gerong continues in the nalik. Although there are some other ways to treat Gambir Sawit. So if you use a different chakapan, which is different vocal text and a different vocal melody, chakapan sinom, actually the gerong begins in the very first iteration of the merong. So that very first merong section that we see on the page here before the bracketed section, it begins there. And the vocal melody is a little bit different and it sings high. So in this instance, the rebab and everyone else must follow that. You can't repeat the merong. If the gerong sings chakapan sinom, you have to go straight to nalik. So this is just an option of some of the different treatment that you can choose to do when you're designing this suite for Gambir Sawit. So now let's take a look at what Gambir Sawit looks like in Pelagnam really quick. So as you can see in Pelagnam, it's essentially the same melody, but a few things change. And it's mainly the threes. So you'll notice that there are a few fours in this melody. So often in Pelagnam, you can get a slightly different flavor, if you will, by playing a piece in Pelagnam, because sometimes you replace those threes, or in other pieces, maybe it can be 5. You replace them with 4. Which the 4, as we know, is not part of the Slendro scale. It's only part of Pelag. So going back to our gending, let's take a look at Panchat Yono, which is another gending that I'd like us to take a look at. So Panchat Yono is another gending that's in Ketuk 2. It has a nalik, but it doesn't have gerong in the merong or nalik. So with Gambir Sawit, because you have the gerong, sometimes the choice is fixed. If you're going to use gerong, then you have to go to nalik. Whereas Panchat Yono, maybe if you don't have enough time, you can skip the nalik. And actually you can skip the nalik with Gambir Sawit as well. So it all depends on responding to the drummer, right? So if you don't have a lot of time, you can play the merong and maybe the drummer wants to keep the tempo fast and go straight into the inga. And so you skip over the nalik. So I think this is a pretty interesting concept that maybe is sometimes hard for people who are unfamiliar with gamelan music to wrap their heads around, because you have these melodies in the nalik that seem very different from the merong. And so you wonder, why are you able to skip them and it still has the identity of the gending? So why is Panchat Yono still Panchat Yono without the nalik? Or why is Gambir Sawit still Gambir Sawit without the nalik? And this is kind of the cool thing about gamelan music is that you have these options and choices to omit or to add certain things. And you can, each time you play gambir sawit or panchat yono, you can play it different every time, and it's still that piece. It still has the identity of that piece. You can play gambir sawit with your group for 2 weeks straight and never play it the same way twice. If you're getting bored with normal gambir sawit, you can also do different, there's a few different treatments of gambir sawit. You can do gambir sawit pancherono, which has some really fun kebaran, lively chiblan drumming sections that are added to it. And there's a few other ways to do that as well. Panchat yono, you can play in Slendro Songo, you can play in Slendro Manyoro, you can play it in Pelag Barang. And I'll come back to Panchat yono in a minute. I'd like us to take a look at one other Gending Merong section called Megamandung. So Megamandung is Gending that's Ketuktu Awis. So it's a little bit bigger. And in my experience, I don't think there's really Gending that use this bigger form that typically have Nilik sections. I could be wrong, but I think typically not, they don't have Nilik sections because they're bigger. Megamandung is also interesting because Megamandung doesn't have its own Inga. So there are some Gending that just have a Merong and then they borrow an Inga, and they can borrow different Inga sometimes. So with Megamandung, the Minga or the Inga is Asug Asug, as you can see from the notation. The cool thing about this is that Asug Asug is just an Inga section. Asug Asug isn't its own Gending in the sense that it doesn't have its own Merong. So Asug Asug can be used as the Inga for several different Gending. Some other examples you can do in Slendro Manyoro, if you do Bantang Warang, then it goes to Asug Asug. Or another piece in Palagnam, you could do Rono Mongolo. So there's a few different options that you can do. So even with one section like this, Asug Asug, it's not confined to doing it one way. And now going back to Panchat Yono, I think I'll just pull this up for now. Going back to our original screen. With Panchat Yono, there was an Inga as we saw, but actually the Inga I think is not as common to play. Normally, I think Asug or Panchat Yono actually uses a ladrang for its Inga section, and it can use many different ladrang. You can use that Inga section, although I think it may be more rare to use that. So if you go to the Inga in Panchat Yono that's written for Panchat Yono, it looks to me, and if anyone knows better and wants to correct me, it looks to me like it may be an Inga that you would just play in Iromo 2, not in Iromo 3 or Iromo 4. However, you can also instead, more commonly, go from Panchat Yono, you can go to Ladrang Pangkur, or Karonsi, or Sri Kawurian, Sri Widodo, Sri Karonrong. So if you see on my chart here, we've done the Merong. We have the option to go to Nilik or not. Typically with Nilik, you want to go back to the Merong before you enter the Inga, although there are some Gending where you don't necessarily have to do that either. You can go from the Nilik into the next section. But we'll just say for now, go back to the Merong, and then you can choose from the Merong. You can either go into the Inga proper, or you can use a Ladrang in substitute of the Inga, or in some cases, you could even use a Katawang. So before we go into Panchat Yono, let's go back to Gambir Sawit, and let's take a look at that Inga. we can talk a little bit about what you might want to do once you get to the Inga. Where is my Gambir Sawit? Where did it go?
Got a question here, Alex.
Sure.
From Ed Luna. He wants to know, is Seg the way you pronounced it? Or there's another way? And actually, maybe Ed, do you want to jump in here and try to pronounce it both ways as you wrote? I'm not sure how to read the phonetical writings that you did there.
Oh yeah, so I just wanted to you to clarify whether it's asug, which is the way that you've been pronouncing it, or eseg as the title and the notation would suggest.
Javanese is fun, Ed.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't think I'm qualified to answer that because I don't speak Javanese. So you may be right. And maybe someone else wants to step in who might know the correct pronunciation that speaks Javanese. Or maybe later.
I don't know. Esek sounds right to me, but I'm not sure. I speak Japanese, but I'm not sure if it's right. It just sounds right, like Esek. But I don't know. But I don't know. I might be wrong.
Okay. Yes, if I mispronounce anything, please correct me. I do not speak Javanese. Okay, so we're looking at Gambir Sawit, and let's take a look at this Inga. So the fun thing that we can do with this Inga is we can use several different iromo. I think more often than not, it would go straight into iromo 3 in the Inga section. However, you can also start in iromo 2, which gives it a totally different feeling, going through the whole gong in iromo 2. And then you can move into iromo 3 after that. You could even start the Inga going from iromo 3 straight into iromo 4. So there's many different ways you can do it. Also, the use of andagan. So this is often an option that you can use for many different gending. Some gending, there are not andagan, but a lot have andagan. So what is an andagan? So andagan is sort of like a vocal interlude that's usually sung by the sinden. So everyone stops in the middle of the gongen and the sinden will sing a melody that's usually a little bit accompanied by the gender. And then the rest of the ensemble will come back in at the end of her melody. This is always an option for pieces that have andagan, but you don't have to do them. So again, this is an example of something where you don't have to do this. And maybe in Western music, we feel like we have to play, all the parts of the piece the way that we heard it and the way that it was written. But in this, you have the option. So in Gambir Sawit, the andagan is often at the end of the first 2 kanongen, at the end of the 3rd gotro of each of those. Rest 1, rest 6. On that 6, usually the ensemble can stop, and then the sinden can sing her solo vocal melody.
Just to let you know, if you move your cursor around, you can point to the notation. We'll see it.
Oh, you can see the cursor.
Yeah.
Great. Yes. So this gotro here and here, you can use andagan, and you can use the andagan in both iromo 3 or iromo 4. So this is an option. Now let's take a look at Panchat Yono. So we already saw with the Inga proper, but why don't we take a look at with Ladrang? So let's start with, here's Ladrang Karonsi. So from Panchat Yono's Merong section, you would, at Gong, you would enter into Ladrang Karonsi. So we're looking at Pelag Barang. So if you wanted to play Ladrang Karonsi, you would have to play Panchat Yono in Pelag Barang. You can't play Slendro Songo, and then go to Palagbarang. One of the key things that you have to do when selecting these is you have to, for sure, make sure that the gong note is the same. So Panchat Yono and Palagbarang, the merang ends on gong 6, and here we begin on gong 6. However, you wouldn't play the buko. You would just go straight into the ladrang in the first section here, the iroma lanchar. If you wanted to play something similar, though, in Slendro Songo, Karonsi is actually pretty much identical in Slendro Songo with the piece Sri Karongrong. And I'll pull that up so that we can see Sri Karongrong. Okay. So we can see that this piece is identical to Karonsi, except for every note is one step lower. And there's a few subtle differences, but it's essentially the same. So if you were, say, playing Panchat Yono and you wanted to go to Sri Karongrong in Slendro Songo one day, and then the next day you wanted to play Panchat Yono again, you could say, well, I really like Sri Karongrong, but we already played that, so why don't we do Karonsi? It's pretty much the same, but now we can experience it in Palagbarang. So this is another option that we can use. Let's go back to my chart now. So we've explored this a little bit. I didn't give an example of a merang that goes to a katawang, but one such example, if you're familiar with the piece Lalar Mangang, you can actually skip over the Inga Ladrang, which would be Lutur. You could go straight to Katawang Panjang Ilang, which I think is a Katawang written by Kinarto Sabdo. So that's an option as well. Now, we get to the fun part. So if you can all see my screen with my little map here. So now, if you focus in on the center, this black hole, this is, I like to think of it maybe as the black hole of uncertainty. So we've gotten out of the Gending with the Inga section, or maybe the Ladrang or Katawang. And now we can choose, either we can end it like that and be done, or we can actually continue to add more to our suite. So once we get into this black hole, and the reason that I've made it a black hole is because there's so many options and you can go back and forth. So you'll notice here that I have off to the left, I have sort of a little galaxy here of different forms: Ladrang, Katawang, Jinaman, Gangsaran, Lagu, Langam, and Lancharan. And over on the right here, I've got Ayayakan, Odo Odo, Serpegan, Palaran, Komudo, and Sampak. And then at the bottom, we have another Patatan. So let's say we wanted to go to a Ladrang. So maybe we played Gambir Sawit, and we played the Inga, and we did all the bells and whistles. We went to Iroma 4, maybe we went to Iroma 4 2 times, and we did the Andagan, and we did all kinds of stuff. And then we decided we want to go to a Ladrang. From there, what you have to do is you have to first make sure that the Ladrang that you're choosing is the same gong note as the Gending, as the Inga. So Gambir Sawat ends on gong 5. So you would first have to choose another Ladrang that would be gong 5. There's a few different Ladrang, there's several different Ladrang that you can choose from. This often has to do with sort of matching the general feeling of the Gending that you had just played. So you wouldn't want to play a Ladrang or Katawang or something that's drastically different in feeling from the Gending that you played. And the reason that this looks like a galaxy, and again, this is not all encompassing here, but the reason this looks like a galaxy is because once you're in this galaxy, you can explore all the different forms if you'd like, to some degree, you can, from a ladrang, maybe you could go to a katawang, or you could go from the ladrang and you could go right back to the black hole, and you could go to Ayakan, or you could go to the black hole and go to Patatan, or you could just end it with the ladrang. So there's many options that you can use to choose. Maybe we can take a look at a few ladrang that would be good with Gambir Sawit.
Alex, Wayne Forrest just had a comment that you could do a Patatan before entering into the ladrang and this sort of portion.
Yes, and so that also that's exactly a great observation, because yes, the way that this is loosely designed, the way that I drew it up is, yes, from the ladrang or from the inga, whichever you were doing coming out of the merong, from there you could go straight to the patatan. And from this black hole, you could go straight to the patatan and then you could end it, or you could go back to the black hole and then you could go to the ladrang, as Wayne pointed out. You could go to Ayakan after the patatan. So you have this sort of two-way channel happening. Okay, let me pull up. What do we want to look at? Let's look at maybe 3 different ladrang that you can use for Gambir Sawit. So Sri Kasusro. So this is a common ladrang that you could do coming from Gambir Sawit, and it uses a gerong section, which is very nice. It has very nice treatment in it. So you'll notice that it's gong 5. And often the cool thing about these suites that happens in the context of professional Javanese musicians at Klenengan is often they might not decide ahead of time what they want to do. And that has the same, it's the same for all the treatment that we've already discussed. So these musicians won't necessarily say, oh, we're going to do Gambir Sawit with Iroma 2 and then Iroma 3 and then Iroma 4. No, you just have to respond in the moment to the drummer or to whoever is in charge of giving the signal for whatever treatment you want to use. And it's not discussed ahead of time. So how do you know what to do? Sometimes with these musicians, maybe at the last second, they'll say, oh, Sri Kasusro, we're going to do that while they're in the middle of the piece. So sometimes you just have to listen to the rabab or to whoever takes charge in the moment, I think is what I've heard more often than not. But so if you're playing Gambir Sawit and then you hear the kendang player give the signal for a ladrang, maybe you don't know which ladrang they're going to play. But then at gong, the rabab starts playing the open 6 over and over again. You say, oh, okay, Sri Kasusro maybe, because it's got the 6-6 rest where you're just hanging on those open 6s right away. So this is one option that uses gerong, which is a nice treatment. Gerong, as we know, is just the male chorus while the Sindan is singing a separate melody often on top of that. Another option, though, is Gonjang Ganjing, which I will pull up here. You know what? I might not have Gonjang Ganjing here ready to go. Gonjang Ganjing is another ladrang that can be played with Gambir Sawit. However, Gonjang Ganjing often uses a Badayan vocal melody as opposed to gerong. So that's when the men and women are singing together, like sort of like a chorus. It's called Badayan. So if you're not feeling like doing gerong, maybe you want to do Badayan because that's sort of a cool contrast to the gerong that was happening in the inga of Gambir Sawit. So you can do Gonjang Ganjing. Gonjang Ganjing starts on gong 5. However, sometimes there are gending where maybe the rabab player wants to go straight to the nalik or straight to the vocal part. And that's common sometimes with Badayan vocals especially. So with Gonjang Ganjing, the vocal melody in the nalik actually goes to gong high 1. So in this circumstance, let's say maybe the rabat player wanted to go straight there. I think I've heard a few different ways that you could do this. Because it's gong 1 and not gong 5, how would you achieve this? So first, the kendang player would start giving the signal for ladrang, and then the rabat player would slide up to high 1 before the end of the inga of gambir sawit maybe. And I think maybe some people would say that you have to change the final gong note to 1, even though it's supposed to be 5. And maybe others would say that you keep it at 5, but the rabab plays to 1 and the vocals sing to 1. That can be an option. I think more often than not, though, they like to do that if the gong matches. So yeah, a third option though for us for gambir sawit, and again, these are not the only 3 options that you can do, but these are just 3 examples that I'm giving, is pakumpulan. Can everyone see pakumpulan here? So this is sort of a fun ladrang. It's a little bit different from the others because it's got a little bit more variety with the balungan melody. As you can see, it's pretty busy, and it's got some special vocal melodies in it, and you can use chiblon drumming. So it's a little bit livelier than the others. So these are sort of 3 different options that we can use for 3 slightly different characters coming from gambir sawit if we want to do this suite. So going back to my chart, and then I think I'd like us to have another listening example to something since we have a little bit of time here. So if we wanted to do a katawang, we could do something maybe like Suba Kastoo, which probably most of you are familiar with that katawang. It's very popular.
Got a quick question, Alex.
Yeah.
Clarification here from
Sure.
Jackson. He asked, do the galaxies suggest order? For example, from a ladrang, you have to go to a katawang or lancharan, not jinaman.
No, you can do, in a way, you could really do whatever you want. I think more often though than not, if you were to do a jinaman or a langam, the ensemble would kind of finish the ladrang, or finish, if you were going straight from the inga, they would just finish it and then start the jinaman or the langam afterwards. You wouldn't just go straight in, although maybe others have experienced differently. That's my understanding. Is I think more commonly, if you were to include a jinaman, like maybe you want to do gambir sawit and you want to go to ular kambang or something, you would end gambir sawit and then you would do jinaman ular kambang. But you could kind of consider it, you're still in Slendro Songo, and maybe that's like the only suite of Slendro Songo that you do for the night for the Klenengan. So there isn't necessarily an order. I would say for the galaxy on the right, it's a little bit more strict because for Klenengan music, at least, I think it's a little less common for you to maybe start in Sampak and then go to Ayakan after that, or Komodo and then Ayakan, because Komodo is usually used to replace Ayakan. It's sort of like a hybrid Ayakan Srapagan kind of feel. So I don't think I've heard an example where they play a Komodo and then they play Ayakan. So again, this is why this map that I've made is loose in that regard. But I didn't want to make it too messy for you with too many arrows and all kinds of restrictions and all of that. So this is sort of a loose interpretation. But yeah, more typically than not, if you go to the right and you start with Ayakan, you would go to maybe Srapagan after that. And then you could go to Sampak, or from the Srapagan, you could enter Palaran, kind of like what Phil was talking about the other session that we had. You can enter the Palaran from the Srapagan, but you could go straight from the Srapagan to Palaran. Or another example, which actually brings me to the musical listening example that I wanted us to hear, is you could go from the Inga and the Inga, and I'm specifically thinking of Majemuk. So let's say you're playing Gending Majemuk, which is another popular Gending. It's heard very commonly in Wayang, but it's also played in Klenengan music. Majemuk is an example where it has its own Inga section, but it's also commonly, the Inga section is replaced with Ladrang Gonjing Miring. So I think there, in terms of Klenengan, there, you can do Inga or Ladrang, and I don't know if one is more popular than the other. I think they're both pretty commonly played. But let's say you were coming from the Inga, you end the Inga, and then from there you could go straight to an Odo Odo, which is something that's really only associated, it's mainly associated with Wayang music. However, you can use it in Klenengan. But my suspicion is that the musicians are sort of thinking of the Wayang context, maybe if they're using this treatment. So you could do Odo Odo, and then from Odo Odo, you could go to Srepegan. And then from Srepegan, you could go to Palarang. So maybe we can listen to a little example of that. I'll play the last, I think maybe the last Kanong or two of the Inga of Majemuk, but they'll have already done the Suak Gropak, Suak Gambyong, which is where they go into Iroma 2 and then push it into Iroma 1, and then they will Suak Gropak where it ends very fast and loud, and they'll stop. And then you'll hear the Odo Odo begin. For those who aren't familiar, Odo Odo is a song that's sung typically from the Dalang and is accompanied just by Gender. And so we'll hear that. Let me share computer sound and we'll listen to an example. This is Majemuk and the Odo Odo. And then we'll hear a little, I'll have us listen to the Srepig section, which is actually Srepegan Pinjalan. So it's a special Srepegan section. And then they'll enter the Palaran, and I'll stop it there. Let's see.
Yaksa kura rupa ri sedeng narendra yaksa alaku kan malyoi kang gambira marang angisesya ngametu prabowo kurama walian desa saprakempo ditya turpalarsa neng lawan wiratrilodra yo
so cool.
That was really cool, Alex. I'd actually mentioned, or he commented that wasn't quite a normal Srepigan.
Yeah, it's funky, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's Srepegan Pinjalan. So I think the balungan is actually happening on the offbeats very often, and on the actual downbeat, it's a rest. So it sounds kind of funky. But yeah, so there within Srepig and Ayak, is this screen still up with my map?
Yep.
Yeah, so with Srepig and Ayak, there's many different options that you can do within one patet. So Srepegan, you can do normal, you can do Pinjalan, there's all, you can do Matraman, and I think maybe it was Pat Midi who was saying during his lecture that, you know, it's probably nicest if you sort of complement the style that you're using. You know, if you go from Ayak to Srepig, so if you do Ayakan Matraman, which is like the Jogja style, then it's nice to do Srepegan Matraman. So that's also something maybe you want to think about when you're choosing what you want to do. But there are many different options. So you're not confined to just one kind once you've selected the patet, right? So I think that about sums up what I'd like to talk about. As you can see, you can really have so much freedom with what you want to do. Oh, the last thing I didn't mention too much was the patetan at the end. So if you want, you can always end with a patetan, no matter what you decide to do. Once you get to the black hole, you can end with a patetan, and you have freedom to kind of do many different patetan. Especially, you want to be thinking about, you know, the size of the gending, maybe the size of the suite that you did. So if you just did very short piece like Wulujong, maybe you wouldn't want to do like a massive patetan. Maybe you just want to do a short one. But you also want to be careful and make sure that some of the patetan that exist out there are not too contrasting in feelings. So a patetan that comes to mind is patetan Abimanyu, which is kind of got a sad feeling to it. So you wouldn't want to play that if you were playing sort of a happier piece. You would want to make sure that it sort of matches the character. But aside from that, you know, you can always default on Jugag, right? So if you don't know, or if you don't know any more patetan, I think it's pretty safe to assume that you can play Jugag and it'll be okay. That's the shortest patetan, and probably the most common that's heard on recordings.
Alex, one thing real quick. Could you just go ahead and maybe give a short description of those other pieces on the left-hand galaxy that you didn't mention? Gangsteran, Lagu, Langam. Maybe you could just tell people what those are, so, just in case they're unfamiliar.
Sure, yeah. So Langam is also sort of like a short, livelier piece. It's more of an editable form, so it's not restrictive in the way that Ladrang or Katawang always have, you know, kanong, this many kanong to the gong, and this many kumpul and all of that. And Lagu can be the same way. Lagu can kind of encompass a lot of different kinds of pieces. Gangsaran is usually a piece that's usually it's just one note where maybe you've heard it where they're like two, 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 and it speeds up. Sometimes in dance, I think that's used transitionally in dance music, but you could do it in Klenengan. Lancharan is typically the shortest form that you would find. That's usually the form that most beginning gamelan ensembles start with. There's lots of different Lancharan, and some of them can be very basic where you're just using Kendang Kali and maybe it's 2 or 3 gong and long and you just keep repeating. Other, you can sort of go into different iromo and you can use chiblan and different vocal melodies. So they're kind of all over the place.
Cool, thanks. Alex, that was an incredible presentation. Covered quite a bit of territory there.
Yeah.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen and then we can do like a small Q&A if people want to, if anybody has any questions about that. Oh, maybe we'd want to keep the chart up actually, just in case somebody had a question about it, but.
Sure, I can put the chart back up.
Yeah, so if people have questions, feel free to jump in the chat and queue yourself up for any questions you may have about anything that Alex talked about, or if you have a question about something he didn't talk about that he may know the answer to, feel free to put your name in there.
Or if you have cool comments.
Yeah, or
something you'd like to share.
Cool comments. We always. Jody Diamond wants to jump in. Jody, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah. Sorry, I jumped the gun in the beginning. I was trying to get this ready. I meant to send this out to people before. In the last issue of Bolungan, we published Roger Vedder's master's thesis, Formal Aspects of Performance Practice in Central Javanese Music. And he'd only been playing 5 years and he was determined to figure out how this works. So he analyzed like 100 recordings. He was at the University of Hawaii. And he tried to figure out just this kind of thing. And he's got all these charts and it's really great. So if this is a topic that you're interested in, here, let me show you, I'll give you an idea. Okay. This is his chart that is kind of like your chart. So actually I have a question because he called this the Talu sequence, going from large forms to smaller forms to smaller forms, which we know the Talu being the overture to a Wayang Kulit. How much do you think the order of things in the Talu influences the order of pieces in a Klanengan, where it's not Wayang in particular?
Are you currently sharing something with the group?
I put a screenshot in the chat.
Yeah, it's in the chat box.
Right.
Let me take a look here.
I mean, his is particular. Sorry, I'm all messed up here. To the Talu, but I'm wondering if the way of doing things, does it come from the Talu, or is the Talu like a reflection of these ideas? And do you see similarities between them? Where do you think the rules come from?
Yeah, I can't, for some reason I can't find what you're sharing, but that's okay. I think I understand what you're asking. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I wonder if someone more knowledgeable has something to contribute as well. But my guess would be, yeah, I think maybe it would be anticlimactic to sort of do a smaller piece and then go to a gending or something like that in the sense of a Klanengan. But also, again, what I was talking about here was,
There it was.
if we were starting with a gending. However, you can skip this whole gending section if you want. You could go straight to starting with a Ladrang or a Katawang, and you can still enter my patented black hole of uncertainty. So
actually, there's one other thing I'd really be interested to know, which is there are certain conventions to this, and people have expectations. If we play Gambar Sawit, we're either going to play the Inga or we're going to play one of these likely Ladrang. But how much flexibility in the actual performance practice do you think there is? I mean, how often do people actually really not know, and it is decided at the time what the next piece is going to be?
That's a really great question. And from my personal experience being in Java, within the past 10 years, as opposed to when I've spoken with people who were in Java, maybe back in the 70s and 80s, I think maybe less is decided without communication ahead of time now. I found that, you know, maybe musicians were at least talking to each other in the middle of the pieces. Although I've heard lots of people mention how back in the day, you know, you didn't have as much of that communication. I also know that maybe less people were using notation back in the day, and I think that just has something to do with probably the less opportunities for Klenaghan and for playing this music nowadays
Yeah.
than before. So there's less
Can,
of an
can I
opportunity to
tell you
practice.
something funny that happened kind of in this vein? Do you mind?
Well, go ahead.
All right. So I was at a Klenaghan at Kitsy's house in Solo in 2018 when we went for the International Gamelan Festival. And you haven't mentioned it, but there's a thing called Wolak Walik where you're playing a piece in
Oh, that was something I was
right on
going
the
to mention.
You switch exactly to Pelog, which it's just like a really cool experience. But they were playing a piece and kind of like in a place where you wouldn't usually do it, like around the third kanong, the Gender player flipped around from Slendro to Pelog. And it's not usually the Gender player's decision. And everyone was like, oh, well, okay, you know, he decided, and then they all followed him. But it was it was unusual to see that Slendro Pelog switch happen there by that person.
Yeah, that's really interesting you bring that up. I forgot to mention that. I really wanted to talk about that a little bit. Molak Malik or Wolak Walik, as Jody was saying, is when you switch between the two tunings between Pelog and Slendro. And I think for a piece like Gambir Sawit, you wouldn't normally, or less commonly, you wouldn't do this in the Merong section. You would do it in the Inga. So maybe you would do one iteration of the Inga and Slendro, and then at Gong, you could switch to Pelog.
Yeah.
My guess is that, yeah, that's something that typically would have to be decided ahead of time. Although, as you pointed out, you know, if the Gender player does it right, we have to follow Pat Midi's advice. We have to be responsive and interactive.
And flex. Well, I like Ben Brinner's words of fixed and flexible.
Yeah.
Way of describing. I think that's a great dichotomy. Like if you're, I've seen it happen a lot in Ladrang, like in Pangkor, it's really popular. Yeah. And it'll happen like at the end of a Willet, the Gongan and Willet. And, but I'll tell you something funny. If you're playing Gender, it's fine. You swivel around and you switch instruments. If you're singing, which I usually was, you have about 2 seconds to like retune your whole inner ear. You've been singing in Slendro and like it changes to Pelog. It's like, okay, you know, it's kind of a challenge, but it's fun.
Yeah.
It's a great sound.
I think I can't remember off the top of my head, but I've heard a recording. I haven't heard it in live performance personally, but I've heard a recording where they slow down for an Andagan in Slendro, but then the Gender player, you know, usually the Gender player gives the first couple notes to the Sindan before the Sindan starts singing the Andagan. The Gender player suddenly starts playing in Pelag Barang, and
wow,
the Sindan has to respond to that. And then when the ensemble comes back in, they all come back in Pelag. So an
that's
example
so cool.
of Molak Malik right there. Yeah, it's really cool.
Have you ever seen people making up like new ways to do this, or kind of new sequences that, I mean, obviously there's a lot of flexibility here, but I'm wondering if how has this developed?
Right. And I don't think I have enough experience to know what would be new and what would be something that's happened for many, many years in some of these circumstances. I know that there's often some of the younger musicians nowadays are kind of doing things that maybe some of the older musicians would say wasn't really common treatment back when they were younger. So that could be an example. A lot of the teachers that I studied with were younger, but I also did study with some of the older generation teachers. So I did have a little bit of that balance. Yeah.
So I notice Phil says in his experience, it's always the Gender player's decision to switch. Gender player. So that's interesting.
Okay. Yeah. I wonder if Phil wants to contribute. I wonder if you were in a situation where it's right on gong, because often I hear in these recordings and when I've heard Molak Malik live, everybody switches at the exact same time on gong if they do it at gong. So I wonder if it's the Gender player's decision spontaneously in that moment, how the musicians can react so fast to something like that.
Well, if you're being nice, you do it half a gotcha before.
That makes sense.
Say that again.
You're really supposed to switch before gong, like a gotra, or if you're in Rangkap, a half a gotra before gong, so that people actually hear the change before the gong.
Does anybody else want to jump in with questions or comments or anything like that? I had a question, Alex. If you could, oops, sorry, I just muted myself. Can you recall any particular story or situation you were in a Klanningan experience or something like that that really threw you through a loop while you're trying to navigate this type of situation?
I think the better question is, can I recall a story where I wasn't thrown for a loop?
There you go.
Yeah, I think pretty much every time I went to a Klanningan, if I was asked to play, there was always at least something where I was like, what the heck? Yeah, that's kind of part of studying gamelan and being in that culture is that kind of thing happens very often. And I think maybe some other people have discussed it, maybe not. I can't remember if it was particularly in this lecture series, but I know I've heard Kitsi talk about that many times. If you're asked to play Gender, they'll try and throw a loop for you, the musicians there, to test you and see what you know, that kind of thing. One thing I would like to mention though, before I forget, is this whole lecture series sort of came about due to this whole COVID-19 thing. And I know a lot of us at home may not have access to gamelan instruments, or at the very least are feeling very lonely that we're only really able to play by ourselves. And I think that now more than ever, although I think it's always great to do this, I think it's really important that we're all listening to as much gamelan as possible, and keeping these pieces in our ears, always listening to something new during this time when we really can't be playing the instruments. Aside from that, though, I've been playing a little bit of gamelan actually on FaceTime. I tried doing it on Zoom and it didn't work as well, but I used FaceTime and it seemed to be working pretty well for Gender and Rabab. Those are two instruments that one of which it can be a little bit behind the beat. So being rhythmically precise isn't as fundamental to being able to play with someone else when it comes to that. So I found that it's worked pretty well. And I've been playing a lot with Ann Steppinger. I don't know if Ann's listening right now, but I don't want to throw you under the bus, Ann, but it's been really fun. And I would highly encourage everyone to seek out that opportunity if they have an instrument at home, or if they can borrow one, if they know someone. It's not ideal, but it's definitely something to do, and it's fun and a way to sort of keep us all engaged with this music, or seek out lessons with a teacher that or have studied with, via FaceTime or Zoom or something like that, because I think it's really important that we do this during this time.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I'm here, and this is Ann, and I agree. It's really helped keep my spirits up during COVID-19, playing with Alex all the time. And also the other thing we've discovered is that you need to use headphones, because if you use headphones, your computer, all it has to deal with, say if I'm playing Rabab, we'll say, Alex's computer only has to deal with the sound of my rabab, or no, sorry, the sound of his gender, and then his headphones deal with the sound of my rabab. And likewise, my computer only has to deal with the sound of my rabab, and then my headphones deals with the sound of his gender. So FaceTime with headphones is the best so far.
I'd like to make a point about the listening that Alex talked about. Just in case people aren't aware, there's an incredible website that I believe it's Stuart Frankel's website, who has basically cataloged so many cassette recordings from old Javanese cassettes that you can stream. And they have almost everything on there. And there's also some really good recordings of master musicians sort of playing single instruments or in a duo situation with another player. So you could listen to a lot of that stuff. And I think it'd be really cool if maybe, I don't know, if a few people would be interested in coming up with maybe like a 3 to 6 song playlist that you can grab from that site, you know, something that's on there that you could grab and listen to, some particularly interesting recordings that you could maybe look at this thing that Alex put up here and see how it fits in here and how it doesn't fit in to his sort of little map here. That could be really cool. If anybody wants to do that, please share that, and we could share that with everybody who's paying attention here.
I'd also like to say really quick that that website that you're referring to, I'm pretty sure those recordings are all courtesy of Barry Drummond.
Yep, that's what Stuart just said on here. He said it's all Barry's. Stuart's hosting them, but they're Barry's recordings.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out that the notation that I shared with you all tonight, if you're not already aware, that's all from Barry Drummond's website. He uploaded all of that notation for anyone to be able to access, and I think it's a really wonderful resource along with his recordings website. And I think it's really incredible what he's done for the gamelan community in terms of the resources and all of that.
Yeah. If anybody has any last questions they want to ask Alex, then please pop in. Otherwise, we'll probably call it a night. But Jody just mentioned that there are some recordings on Joko Sutrisno's website as well from the Minnesota group. I don't remember what's the name of his group. Does anybody recall that off the top of your head? Sumnar, Sumnar, I think, something like that, or Summunar, Sumnar. So there was actually a pretty cool, I think it was a Minnesota state sponsored project that brought in several of the expert gamelan musicians, the Indonesians living in the United States, to Minneapolis or St. Paul, and they recorded 5 or 6 pieces from every instrument, or from 5 or 6 or 7 different instrument standpoints, and they have a close-up view of each of the instruments while they're playing all these pieces. So that's a really cool resource for learning stuff. Yeah. Well, it doesn't look like there's any more questions popping up. So I would like to thank Alex again for his black hole of uncertainty and all the things he was more certain about. And thank you all for coming. And if you do have the ability to make a donation and you haven't had the chance to do that yet, today is a great day. We're going to be sending those donations in about a week and a half. So please do that. And then on Sunday, we're going to have a discussion with Darsono Hadiarharjo. And he is actually doing a pre-recorded interview with Chris Miller from Cornell. And they're going to be talking about, it's actually cool, I just listened to it today and we're going to do some editing on it. But he's going to be talking a bit about his parents, Darsono's parents, and their sort of familial ties to a lot of important sort of history and gamelan recording and playing throughout Central Java, all around Solo and also in Semarang and other places. So it's sort of like a family history of Darsono's family. It's very interesting how his family connects to all these really important musical traditions that if you're looking on through Barry's recordings, you're going to see all these different groups of musicians, and we're going to be talking about a number of those on Sunday, and the connection, the familial connection through all those different groups. So it should be a fairly interesting discussion. So I'm not sure if he's going to be on for a Q&A or not afterwards, but that remains to be seen. And so, yeah, we'll see you then. And then next Wednesday is Sutrusno Hartono, who's going to be talking about his experience with a variety of different types of gamelan music. He comes from a different perspective from Yogyakarta, and then also living in Vancouver and doing a bit of new music composition as well as some classical gamelan music. So that's next Wednesday, a week from today. Thank you all, and have a great evening or whatever time it is wherever you are, and see you next time. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks.